By the spring of 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy believed the war in the Pacific was unfolding exactly as planned. Pearl Harbor had been crippled. Guam, Wake Island, Hong Kong, the Philippines, and Singapore had fallen in rapid succession. To Japanese admirals, these victories confirmed a long-held belief. The United States lacked the discipline, endurance, and spirit required for a decisive naval war. This assumption did not appear overnight. For decades, Japanese naval doctrine had been shaped by the idea of kantai-kessen, the belief that any war with the United States would be decided by one massive, decisive battle. American sailors, in this view, were expected to lose morale quickly after suffering heavy losses. Japan's leadership believed democracy produced comfort, not warriors. Cultural prejudice reinforced this confidence. Many Japanese officers viewed American sailors as technically competent but mentally weak, individualistic, poorly trained for sacrifice, and reliant on machines rather than skill. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself warned against underestimating America's industrial power, but even he believed U.S. forces would falter once shocked by early defeats. Pearl Harbor seemed to prove them right. The U.S. Pacific Fleet lay burning in the harbor, and American response appeared chaotic. Japanese intelligence reports described American pilots as inexperienced and American commanders as slow to adapt. Compared to Japan's elite naval aviators, hardened by years of combat in China, the Americans seemed unprepared for modern carrier warfare. What Japan failed to see was what those early defeats were producing beneath the surface. American sailors were learning fast. Surviving crews from Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, and countless skirmishes were gaining real combat experience. New doctrines were forming. Radar was being integrated into fleet tactics. Damage control procedures were refined through brutal necessity. And most importantly, American sailors were becoming accustomed to loss without breaking. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942 offered a warning Japan largely ignored. Though tactically indecisive, it marked the first time Japanese expansion had been halted. U.S. carrier crews fought effectively despite heavy losses, and American commanders demonstrated flexibility Japan did not expect. Japanese planners dismissed these signs as temporary. They believed the Americans had already reached their peak resistance. Midway, they assumed, would deliver the final psychological blow, destroying the remaining U.S. carriers and forcing Washington to negotiate. Instead, this confidence blinded them. They underestimated American codebreakers who had already uncovered the Midway plan. They underestimated junior officers willing to attack against impossible odds. And above all, they underestimated the resilience of American sailors, men who had already learned that survival depended not on perfection, but adaptation. Before Midway, Japan believed it was fighting an opponent who would collapse under pressure. What they were actually facing was a navy in transformation, one forged by early defeat, driven by urgency and ready to fight back. That realization would come too late. In early June 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy set in motion what Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto believed was an elegant and unavoidable trap. Operation MI was designed to draw out the remaining American aircraft carriers and destroy them in a single, decisive battle. On paper, it was flawless. In reality, it relied on one dangerous assumption: that the enemy would behave exactly as predicted. The plan was complex to the point of fragility. Japan's powerful fleet was divided into separate forces, spread across hundreds of miles of ocean. Carrier groups, battleships, invasion transports, and a diversionary force aimed at the Aleutian Islands were all meant to operate in precise coordination. Any delay, miscommunication, or unexpected resistance could unravel the entire operation. Japanese admirals believed such risks were acceptable. American forces, they assumed, were disorganized and unaware. Midway Atoll would be attacked at dawn, its defenses neutralized, and the U.S. Navy forced to respond blindly. But even before the first aircraft launched, the trap was already compromised. Unknown to Japan, American codebreakers at Station HYPO in Hawaii had deciphered enough of Japan's naval code to identify Midway as the target. Admiral Chester Nimitz positioned his carriers northeast of the island, precisely where Japanese planners believed no enemy ships could be. On the morning of June 4th, Japanese aircraft struck Midway as planned. The attack caused damage but failed to eliminate the island's airfields. Reports from pilots were unclear. Some claimed a second strike was necessary. Others warned of American ships in the area. Admiral Chuchi Nagumo now faced an unexpected dilemma. His carrier's hangar decks were crowded with aircraft armed for anti-ship attacks, while others were being rearmed for a second strike on Midway. Orders changed. Bombs were removed, torpedoes loaded, then reversed again. Fuel lines, ammunition, and aircraft filled the decks, turning the carriers into floating powder kegs. Meanwhile, American reconnaissance planes pressed desperately to locate the Japanese fleet. Many were shot down. Some sent incomplete reports, but enough information reached U.S. commanders to confirm the enemy's position. As Japanese decks descended into controlled chaos, American torpedo squadrons attacked first. They were slow, outdated, and devastatingly vulnerable. One by one, they were destroyed by Japanese fighters. But their sacrifice forced Japanese combat air patrols down to low altitude and kept them there. At 10:20 a.m., the trap snapped shut. Not on the Americans, but on Japan. U.S. dive bombers arrived almost simultaneously from different directions. Finding Japanese carriers exposed, decks crowded with fueled and armed aircraft. Within minutes, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were engulfed in flames. Japan's carefully timed operation collapsed in less than 5 minutes. The perfect plan had failed not because it lacked strength, but because it could not adapt. Precision had replaced flexibility. Assumptions had replaced observation. At Midway, Japan discovered that a war cannot be won by plans alone, especially when the enemy refuses to follow the script. When the smoke began to clear over the Pacific on June 4, 1942, even American commanders struggled to fully understand what had just happened. 3 Japanese aircraft carriers lay burning, struck down in minutes. To many observers, the outcome looked like a miracle, a stroke of unbelievable luck. But the truth behind Midway was far more complex. American sailors did not win by chance alone. They won through a combination of hard-earned skill, disciplined leadership, and a willingness to act under impossible pressure. The torpedo squadrons that attacked first paid the highest price. Flying slow, obsolete aircraft without fighter escort, they pressed forward anyway. Squadron after squadron was cut down by Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Of the 41 torpedo planes launched that morning, only 6 returned. Their attacks achieved almost no direct hits, yet they changed the battle. By forcing Japanese fighters to remain at low altitude and drawing defensive fire away from the carriers, these crews created the narrow window that made everything else possible. Their sacrifice was not accidental. It was the result of training, discipline, and an understanding that the mission mattered more than survival. Above them, American dive bomber pilots faced their own uncertainty. Many were low on fuel. Several groups became lost. Communications failed. Decisions were made in seconds, not minutes. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's choice to follow a lone Japanese destroyer, rather than return to the carrier, proved decisive. That single judgment call led American aircraft directly to the Japanese fleet. Leadership mattered at every level. Admiral Chester Nimitz trusted his commanders with freedom of action. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, new to carrier command, resisted the urge to micromanage and allowed his pilots to strike when the opportunity appeared, even though the situation was far from ideal. Luck was present, but it favored those prepared to exploit it. When American dive bombers arrived over the Japanese carriers, they encountered chaos below. Aircraft were being refueled. Bombs and torpedoes lay exposed. Damage control crews were overwhelmed before they could react. The result was catastrophic, but not accidental. American sailors had learned from early defeats. They had improved coordination, refined damage control, and learned to fight as a system rather than as individual units. Midway was the moment those lessons paid off. What Japan saw that day was not reckless courage or blind fortune. It was a navy that had absorbed punishment, adapted quickly, and trusted its people to act decisively. At Midway, American sailors proved they were not amateurs carried by luck, but professionals shaped by crisis, ready to strike back when it mattered most. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, the hours following the American strikes at Midway were marked by disbelief. The loss of 3 fleet carriers in a single morning was not merely a tactical setback. It was a psychological shock unlike anything Japan had experienced. Officers who had planned for victory now struggled to understand how events had spiraled so completely out of control. Admiral Chuchi Nagumo initially refused to accept the scale of the disaster. Reports were fragmented, contradictory, and difficult to believe. Fires raged aboard Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, spreading faster than damage control teams could contain them. Ammunition cooked off. Flight decks collapsed. Crews fought desperately to save ships they had believed untouchable only hours earlier. When the 4th carrier, Hiryu, launched a counterattack and temporarily crippled the USS Yorktown, hope briefly returned. For a moment, Japanese commanders believed balance could still be restored. But that illusion vanished by late afternoon, when American aircraft located Hiryu and reduced her to a burning wreck as well. By nightfall on June 4th, Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, over 300 aircraft, and many of its most experienced pilots and deck crews. These losses could not be replaced quickly or at all. Japan's naval aviation strength had been built over decades, through selective training and combat experience in China. In a single day, that advantage was gone. The emotional impact was immediate. Survivors spoke of silence on the bridges, of admirals staring at charts without speaking. The confidence that had driven Japan's early victories dissolved into uncertainty. For the first time, Japanese commanders confronted the reality that the enemy was not inferior, but adaptable, resilient, and increasingly dangerous. Equally disturbing was the realization of how thoroughly American intelligence had anticipated their moves. The possibility that naval codes had been compromised shook Japan's leadership. If the enemy could predict operations, then no plan, however complex, was truly secure. Midway forced a painful reassessment. The doctrine of decisive battle had failed. Precision and bravery had not compensated for rigidity. Worse still, Japan now faced a prolonged war of attrition, exactly the kind of conflict its leaders had hoped to avoid. The psychological shift was irreversible. After Midway, Japanese admirals no longer spoke of inevitable victory. Strategy became defensive. Risk tolerance narrowed. Opportunities were avoided rather than seized. Midway did not end the war in the Pacific, but it ended Japan's confidence. From that moment forward, every operation carried the weight of doubt, and every American carrier represented a threat that could no longer be dismissed. In the weeks following Midway, the Imperial Japanese Navy did not speak publicly about defeat. Official statements minimized losses, and the true scale of the disaster was concealed from the Japanese public. But within naval headquarters, the reality was unmistakable. Midway had permanently altered how Japan viewed its enemy. Japanese admirals now understood that the United States was not merely persistent, it was strategically dangerous. American sailors had demonstrated an ability Japan had not anticipated: rapid adaptation under fire. Midway revealed a navy capable of learning faster than Japan could replace its losses. The shift became visible almost immediately. Japanese operations grew more cautious. Carrier task forces avoided unnecessary risks. The aggressive, forward-leaning strategy of early 1942 was replaced by defensive calculations. The fear was no longer losing ships, it was losing irreplaceable personnel. At Guadalcanal, this new reality became painfully clear. Night battles, once dominated by Japan, turned increasingly costly. American radar, improved coordination, and growing confidence narrowed Japan's advantages. Even when Japan won tactical engagements, the losses were unsustainable. Equally alarming was America's industrial response. New carriers, aircraft, and trained crews began appearing at a pace Japan could not match. What Japan had assumed would be a short war was evolving into a prolonged struggle of production and endurance, the very scenario Admiral Yamamoto had warned against. Japanese commanders also recognized a cultural misjudgment. American sailors were not undisciplined or fragile. They were decentralized, empowered, and encouraged to make decisions under pressure. This flexibility, once dismissed as weakness, proved decisive in modern naval warfare. Internal assessments after Midway increasingly described American forces as methodical, aggressive, and resilient. Underestimation gave way to caution. Caution gave way to strategic restraint. By 1943, Japan was no longer attempting decisive victory. It was attempting survival. Every operation assumed American interception. Every carrier sortie assumed losses. Confidence had been replaced by calculation, and calculation by inevitability. Midway did more than destroy ships. It shattered assumptions. Japanese admirals learned that wars are not won by tradition or early success, but by adaptability, leadership, and the ability to endure loss. From that point forward, American sailors were never underestimated again, because Japan had learned, at devastating cost, exactly what kind of enemy it was facing.